Hey, it's Steve Grant here, and I'm here with one of our nutrition and functional medicine practitioners, Danny. And in this video, we're going to be talking about insulin resistance, and in particular, we're going to be looking at natural kind of ways in which you can prevent insulin resistance as well. So, Danny, do you want to kind of kick things off with just a sort of brief explanation as to what insulin resistance is, potentially some of the sort of conditions or risk factors that there might be associated to insulin resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, insulin is a hormone that our pancreas produces. So every time we eat, the pancreas will release a bit of insulin, and its job is to sort of act as a key to allow the carbohydrates that we eat into our cells to be used up as energy. And over time, if we sort of chronically stimulate the pancreas to produce insulin, sometimes the sort of mechanisms can go wrong or break down and become faulty. And we have a situation where when we eat, the pancreas is either not producing enough insulin or insulin can't do its job properly. And we have a situation where we have sort of carbohydrates or sugars in our bloodstream, which can sort of cause further problems. In terms of what sort of conditions we sort of associate it with, it's kind of like a sliding scale. So we've got sort of type 2 diabetes right at the end. And sort of before that, we have sort of insulin resistance and then pre-diabetes. So it's a sliding scale. Running sort of parallel to that, we have sort of being overweight and obesity. That definitely can you can see sort of insulin resistance happening in the background in those cases as well as a women's health condition, PCOS, which we know is associated with insulin resistance.
Yeah, cool, perfect, that's great. Yeah, I think like some of the other sort of like symptoms that you can pick up on sometimes, like there are some interesting ones, like you can see like skin discoloration changes, skin tags are often associated with it as well. And you mentioned about kind of like overweight and obesity, that there seems to be more of a correlation with kind of like central obesity, so people storing more sort of midsection body fat, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the easiest things we can do is just check our waist to hip ratio and make sure that it's in a sort of optimal sort of place. So risk, I think people in, we got to consider those people in, let's say, Southeast Asians, or maybe it's Africans or Latin Americans. Those types of populations we know have a sort of higher risk factor for developing insulin resistance and diabetes. So if you are in that sort of category, it's worth just being a little bit more on top of these types of factors. In terms of body composition, waist to hip ratio is definitely something to look at, but also just looking at where your overall body fat levels are in relation to your sort of skeletal muscle mass or lean mass is going to be also important.
Yeah, because sometimes the body mass index can be a little bit misleading, can't it? Especially in some of those kind of southeastern populations where the body fat percentage levels are higher, but the skeletal muscle mass levels are lower. So the BMI tends to be kind of within normal ranges, but actually the body fat percentage is relatively high, and there's an increased risk associated there with that insulin resistance. Okay, great. So in terms of what are some of the natural things that we can do to help prevent insulin resistance, and maybe actually even reverse insulin resistance as well?
Yeah, so if we sort of just split this into sort of two categories, we've got nutrition and we've got sort of lifestyle exercise. When it comes to nutrition, I think one of the sort of most basic things we can focus on is matching our carbohydrate intake to our activity levels. So if you are somebody that's pretty sedentary, exercises 30 minutes a day, you're largely desk-based, then there's probably no need to have as much carbohydrates as somebody else who might be doing 10,000 steps a day and exercising 3-5 times a week. So fundamentally, just matching your carbohydrate intake to your activity levels, we know will help. Further to that, just increasing things like protein intake and sort of vegetables and fiber intake will help from a satiety point of view. So we want to make sure that we're going from sort of meal to meal, relatively full, and managing our blood sugar levels to avoid sort of crashes and afternoon dips, which is when we would tend to sort of reach for those highly calorific foods, which can further exacerbate sort of weight gain and insulin resistance. From an exercise point of view, I think the minimum we want to do is sort of 30 to 60 minutes a day. If we can throw in some resistance training, even better, because we know how important muscle is for insulin sensitivity. Muscle is this sort of big storage point for carbohydrates. So the more we have, the more insulin sensitive we are.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think there's mechanisms that go on inside the cell as well, that when you do kind of like higher intensity interval training and strength training, you get these kind of glucose transporters that just naturally go to the surface of the cell. And they then don't require even insulin to be able to kind of like pull it in. So you can draw more glucose into the cell without even the presence of insulin being there. And then that has that ability to sort of lower the overall insulin requirement and need as well. So is that a nice way of starting to bring the insulin levels down to hopefully resensitize the cell a little bit more?
Yeah, this goes back to that point about matching your carb intake with your activity levels. So
yeah,
if you want to go a little bit further, sort of basing your carbohydrate intake around your sort of exercise sessions would be even better.
Yeah, yeah. So would you say kind of like two of the best forms of training then, you mentioned obviously about strength training, trying to put on a little bit of muscle size. Is there reasonable evidence with like more higher intensity sort of like interval based training or cardio based training versus more steady state stuff? Where do you sit with that?
I think there might be a slight favorable sort of effect when you go more high intensity. We know it is slightly more anabolic, but overall, my recommendations will always be just to choose something that you prefer and that you will do and will have less resistance to not doing.
Yeah. So far we've got manage the carbohydrate intake, particularly manage it based upon what your kind of activity levels are, and potentially even kind of do a bit of nutrient timing around like exercise as well. Look at the type of training that you're doing. Ideally, put in some strength training, but obviously just move and do things that you enjoy, and just get moving a little bit more. I think there's a little bit on kind of like sleep being a factor like that. That's certainly something that can lead on to a bit more insulin resistance. I think there's some research on once you start to sleep chronically under 6 hours, then that can create a slightly more insulin resistant state. So I imagine that's a factor. You mentioned one about I think the whole one of the main symptoms that you see with insulin resistance when it develops is often this tiredness after eating. So people eat food and then they feel a bit more lethargic and tired, and often when they feel more lethargic and tired, they then reach for more kind of like carby, sugary type things to sort of try and lift their energy up a little bit more as well. Is there any benefit, do you think, are there any other things beyond kind of exercise and nutrition and sleep that we mentioned? Anything else that you would consider?
Well, I think sleep and stress sort of go hand in hand, right? So we're chronically underslept, we will have a high propensity to reach for those higher calorific foods. Stress management does just sort of go hand in hand with that. Typically, when we are sort of chronically overstressed, maybe it's just a build-up of small things that happens throughout the day, whether it is just your alarm clock, and then being in traffic, and then just tons of emails. We sort of want to reward ourselves with something sugary, something high in fat, to get that sort of dopamine response. And that's just going to cause a sort of vicious cycle of high sugar levels and then troughs, which just does exacerbate this whole situation. So managing stress, but that does just come from getting a good night's sleep, I think is really important.
Yeah, because I think it's very much like when it comes to sort of insulin resistance and managing insulin resistance, it does, particularly in the earlier stages of insulin resistance, it really comes down to sort of like foundational kind of elements of health, right? It's kind of like movement, it's your nutrition, it's managing sleep, it's managing stress. So it's managing the kind of pillars that we'd see as good health. And by doing that, we often then see improvements in weight and body composition, improvements therefore in insulin sensitivity, and then a lot of these conditions and symptoms associated to insulin resistance then start to actually just improve themselves. It's only really with very progressed kind of insulin resistance into into really quite progressed type 2 diabetes, that you need to get a little bit more kind of intricate maybe with some of the things that you do, like looking potentially at nutraceuticals to work on certain pathways in the cell that help to improve insulin sensitivity. But I think most people aren't there. There's a population of people that are there. Most people are in that category of what can we do from a sort of foundational point of view to actually help improve that. And then, as you'll know, with the populations that you'll see, there can often be, improvements in conditions like PCOS, reduce cardiovascular risk and reduce central obesity and increase energy levels, a classic one when you start to improve someone's insulin sensitivity as well. So all of these things kind of fall in place as those foundational elements are put in place. Cool. I think that pretty much wraps it up. I think that's a fairly good summary on some of the natural things that we can do to help improve insulin sensitivity and hopefully either reverse or prevent insulin resistance. Is there anything else you want to add, Danny?
No, I think we've covered it. So managing sleep and stress, matching carbohydrate intake to activity levels, moving daily if you can, prioritizing weight training or resistance training if you can, but just generally moving, I think covers a lot.
Perfect. Thanks, Danny. So if you are interested in getting professional support anytime, you can get in touch. Danny specializes in working with people with weight loss, body composition issues, insulin resistance, metabolic health, and a variety of other things as well. So be sure to get in touch, and we're more than happy to support you on your health journey. Cool. Cheers, Danny. Appreciate your time.
Cheers.